Some of the time. All right, thanks. Well, it's wonderful to have you all here tonight. Thank you very much for coming. I'm really honored that you would come for the presentation this evening. This is a presentation that encompasses the work of about 35 years. I started interviewing people. Austin Hammond in 1984 was the first person I talked to related to this, and it's continued all the way up to now. I'm continually being educated about this. So thank you very much for coming today. I want to start by reading a little piece to open with here. The luminous midsummer night beckons. 3 men in a cottonwood canoe slice across mirroring water at evening slack tide, when gulls are silent and sea currents hesitate. The usual breeze is dead. Each man fore and aft lifts his paddle. The craft glides a long time before it pauses at the entrance of Chilkat Inlet, where the ice-blue walls of Sitkaya, also known as Davidson Glacier, fill the starboard view. Whenever the ice walls collapse, house-sized chunks explode, splash into Lynn Canal, and are sucked away by currents, becoming obstacles to safe passage. Cross-legged in the center of the canoe, the old man straightens his back and touches the amulets that hang from his neck. Rising from a mass of dreadlocks is an ornate shakyat, a ceremonial hat, draped with winter-white ermine pelts. Sea lion whiskers sprout from the crown like exclamation points. The carved head of raven protrudes just above the eyes that roll inward as the icht communicates with the unseen. Icht is medicine man or shaman. He prepares to dive. In a dream only days before, spirit helpers, the yik, warned the ich of the invaders approaching. Residents needed to be on their guard. After a 4-day fast, the old man commanded his nephews to transport him to the inlet mouth where Sitkaya met tidewater. Now they tie a 20-fathom line around their uncle's chest. He grasps the amulets hanging from his neck, bear claws, eagle talons, killer whale tooth, and begins to sing. The nephews lift their uncle out of the canoe while he shakes a rattle in one hand, holding eagle down in the other. They lower him to the sea floor. Sometime later, the nephews feel a tug on the line. When the icht resurfaces, he still holds the rattle and dry feathers. 3 ships will arrive on the next tide, he predicts. The next day, some say, 3 boats belonging to Captain George Vancouver sailed into Chilkat Inlet. Lieutenant Joseph Whidbey's subsequent confrontation marked the tenor of Chilkat encounters to come and reflected the passion locals felt for their homeland. I wanted to start with this opening because this book is about the white man coming to Southeast Alaska. It specifically is about the northern part of Southeast, although it certainly involves Juneau and Sitka. Juneau not here at that time, but certainly Sitka, the Auk people of this area, Wrangell, etc., throughout Southeast, but mostly in northern Southeast Alaska. And once again, I just want to say I'm really honored to be speaking here today. Wasasayati. I'm honored that I'm able to tell this story in this land of the Tlingit people, the Auk people here in this area. And I really, really am honored that people I talked to over the years, the Tlingit elders and their families, guided me very carefully and kind of slowly through this process. As I said, it took about 35 years, which is a lot of listening. And, you know, many of you have experience. You've lived in Southeast. And we'll talk about this. There's a lot that I can say about this. But my name's Dan Henry, and I am not a trained historian. I'm a rhetorician, which is something that people don't admit all the time necessarily. I'm a debate coach, and I study persuasive messages. And so that is really what drove me to this story in the first place, is the Tlingit people of Southeast are very powerful orators. And I came to Haines in 1982, 83, looking to study powerful orators. I was interested in the Tlingit people, but I was also interested in John Muir, who was also known as an orator later in his life. And so the story that you're about to hear tonight is comprised of events relating to intercultural exchange, people trying to persuade each other. In the process of writing this book, I looked into a lot of Native American histories, and the sad thing is in America that most of the Native American histories that you read are about battles or loss, war, and illness, and really tragic sorts of things. And those were all real. I don't mean to take away from those a bit, and certainly that was happening in Southeast Alaska as well. However, this is a different kind of story. It does involve the idea of manifest destiny, that white people were going to take over the continent and they were going to subjugate other people in the name of their religion. It does involve that, but it also involves one man, John Muir, who was very much part of that whole culture, and yet came up here and interacted with Tlingit people in a way that they had never seen before, that was very, very different, and some unusual things happened because of that. So once again, thanks so much for being here tonight. I'm really gratified. There's a lot that I could say, and before I really get into it, I'll just tell you this one little story. I'm from Haines, so I've been there for a long time, and I've been giving talks at the Sheldon Museum for years and years and years related to little parts of this book as it went on. And oftentimes I would invite some of the elders to come, and they would be in the crowd. And let's say about 10 years ago or so, I was giving a talk there, and there were 90, 100 people there or so, and I got into it. I was all enthusiastic. I had all my slides out there. Well, the talk went 4 hours. And that was just for one chapter of this book. I'm not going to do that to you tonight, okay? It went 4 hours, and then after 2 hours, people started sneaking out. They give me a little wave. We got to go. They were out, and then more people left. Well, after 4 hours, there were only 4 people left, and they were 4 Tlingit elders who are used to long speeches. And so they were sitting out there, and then at the end, I finally said, well, any questions? And Ed Warren raises his hand and says, just one thing. In the Tlingit tradition, we supply coffee and cookies. Why didn't you have any? And I learned a big lesson right there. Keep it short, especially if you don't have coffee and cookies, which we don't tonight. So let me just introduce myself properly a little bit and tell you just a bit about myself. As I said, I'm a rhetorician. I really started, first time I went to Alaska was in 1971. We drove up the Alcan Highway and did the whole tour, and I told my folks, this is it. I'm coming up there. I'm gone. And then I worked on my master's degree at University of Oregon, and it was a master's in rhetoric and communication. And my master's thesis was a history of American land use conflict rhetoric. And the last 150 pages were about Anilka. And so it was about a 350-page work in which I wanted to look at all of the persuasive messages used in public lands debates. And actually, that will be the next book that comes out of here in about 3 or 4 years. I ended up getting a number of grants, traveled around the country, put 60,000 miles on rental cars, interviewed 248 land use rhetors, including, head of the Sierra Club, head of the American Mining Congress, head of the American Cattlemen's Association, head of the American Petroleum Institute, and lots of Congress people and Native American land managers, etc. And I asked them all the same 4 questions, which I'm not going to tell you about right now. You'll have to read the book. So in 82, I moved up here and came to Haines looking specifically for information about John Muir's meeting with the Tlingit people in that area. Because, and I know many of you have read Travels in Alaska, and in Travels in Alaska, he spends quite a bit of time talking about his first voyage up there, 1879. And there is one chapter in Travels in Alaska in the country of the Chilkats. And I'm sure half of you or more of you know what I'm talking about there. And it was the longest stretch of writing that John Muir had ever written about Native Americans. I opened up that chapter and read through it. It's like, this is different. This is not him chasing glaciers. This is him coming to Native people and respecting them and learning about them and being humble rather than being the know-it-all, which is an easy way of saying that John Muir liked to talk about what he knew a lot. And so in that chapter, I just found it fascinating. Of course, I teach intercultural communication and debate and that sort of thing, so I really zeroed in on that. So I was working for the Forest Service up here, helping run the Youth Conservation Corps camp at Eagle River for a number of years. And I decided that I really wanted to move to Alaska and start some research and write something about this weird meeting that John Muir had with the Tlingit people in northern southeast Alaska. So I moved to Haines. And I got a job with Ray Maneker, who was running the Chilkat Valley News at the time. And I was the reporter for the Chilkat Valley News, and I said, Ray, what do you want me to write about this week? And he said, you're the reporter, you find the stories. That's the way Ray was. Probably people out there know Ray a bit. And so I started looking around, and the Chilkoot Cultural Camp was going on at the Chilkoot River, run by Austin Hammond. And so I thought this would be a great story. So I went out there and started interacting with people, and really they were very, very welcoming. I met a lot of elders out there. And this was in 1983, actually summer of 84. And there were people out there, George and Matilda Lewis, Nathan Jackson, Chauncey Jacobs, a number of people who really kind of laid the foundation. And I asked them if I could interview them because I was curious about this John Muir incident, but I wanted to just kind of start early and just find out about the people in general. And so I went to Austin first, who is the headman or was the headman of the Chilkoot people, and said, do you mind me interviewing you? And he said, fine. And he said, what do you want to talk about? And I said, well, I'd really like to find out about John Muir's meeting with the Tlingit people up here in November of 1879. And he said, okay, come back tomorrow. So I came back the next day, and I had my cameraman, and we were all ready to go. We signed the permissions and whatnot, and this was going to be in the Sheldon Museum. And so he said, what's the question again? I said, I want you to tell me a little bit about how the Tlingit people reacted to John Muir coming up here a number of years ago. And he says, okay. He pauses, and he begins to speak in Tlingit, and he speaks in Tlingit for 4 hours. And Dixie Johnson, who was also there, Pete and Dixie Johnson. Dixie is translating for me, kind of at the side of my ear as he's talking. And of course, where does he start? He starts with the Great Flood. And at the end of 4 hours, he hadn't even got to John Muir yet or any of that. And I could see right then this was going to be a long-term project. It was going to take a long time. And so the next day I came back with my cameraman, and he started up again, and he started talking about things, and he talked for 2 or 3 hours and then finally stopped, kind of sat down. He was exhausted, and I said, well, what about John Muir? And he says, I'm all out of questions for today. And so I came back there and came back and came back and then went to his house and went to the other elders and ended up working for the museum, doing interviews, oral histories with elders. Had an opportunity to talk to 25 elders altogether, and 16 of them appear in this book. And as I said, I was motivated by the fact that many Native American histories have a lot of loss and death in them. I was interested in one that actually had Native American descendants of those people in history talking about what happened and how it affected them. And so now we have a book where the descendants of those people who met John Muir initially get to talk about that. However, I never got to hear it from Austin, because as many times as I interviewed him, he finally passed away in 1994, and I still had not heard the story yet. But not all was lost. I kept talking to people, asking questions, and then eventually I met and started talking, developed a relationship with Sally Burriton, who lives out in Cluckwan, and she is the niece of Austin Hammond, and she was the scribe of the clan. She was assigned at age 3 to be the scribe, to remember everything that is important to the clan. And that kind of blew me away. And so I asked her, hey, what about this John Muir story? And she did remember everything about the clan, because it took her a long time to get to the John Muir part. But what was important is that they felt that if I was interested in that, I needed some context. I needed to really understand the culture, why they interacted with him in that way, what was going on there in the first place. And so I'm really grateful to Sally and Austin and the other elders who took me on a very long journey and enhanced my sense of patience and time, and really allowed me to tell this story. So thank you very much for coming in here today. As I said, I'm a rhetorician. I'm a debate coach. I'm a writer. I'm proud of the things I've done as writing, but the thing I'm most proud about is that I coached the 2002 University of Alaska Anchorage National Championships in intercollegiate debate. In the out rounds, quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals, we beat UCLA, University of Utah, and the U.S. Air Force Academy. And I don't know how many of you know that University of Alaska was #1 in debate in 2002, but my wife is tired of hearing about it, so I'm just telling you guys. Because Alaskans know how to debate. And what else are you going to do in the winter? There's about 2 or 3 other things you can do in the winter, but debating you can do while you're doing those 2 or 3 other things that people do in the winter. So anyway, I was very interested in the debate qualities going on with this too. So I went to Haynes to start writing a rhetorical history. And let me just move through a couple of things here. I want to show you a few of the people I talked to, and then we'll kind of get into these stories. Also, I'm going to add a little piece to this that I haven't talked about before with this. In chapter 3 of my book, it really focuses not on John Muir, but the first half of the book is about white guys coming up to Upper Lynn Canal and how they were met and what was going on. And chapter 3 is all about the great eclipse of 1869. And, last year we were kind of eclipse crazy, certainly down south. In 1869, it was a rather phenomenal experience with the great solar eclipse that happened during that time. And I was reminded of that. I was going to skip it, but I was reminded of it last night. I was walking around and I saw the statue of William Henry Seward up there. And I actually had an opportunity to be involved with that. Tony Tangs and Carlton Smith and some other people had been interacting with me and had read this chapter 3 because they were not aware of the significance of Seward's scar, which is going to come out in this story as well. So we'll talk about that. So he's in there as well. Let's see if this piece of technology is going to work. There we go. Let me, here's Southeast Alaska. I had my friend Tim Shields, who some of you might know, he's an artist in Haines. I said, I want you to draw me a map of Southeast Alaska that looks like a cross between Google Earth and Fritz the Cat. And so this is what we have. And you can see John Muir's canoe voyage in the dotted lines. You'll see this map again a little bit, but you can see also, I also said I wanted him to make Klukwan look like the capital of the West Coast. Because in Klukwan, they considered themselves the capital of the Tlingit domain. And there were the Whale House, which many of you know about, which is beautifully preserved up in Klukwan right now. You know, that was carved as a symbol of the strength of the Klukwan people. In the early 1800s, probably 1810 or so, the headman in Klukwan heard about the White House back in Washington, D.C., and he said, well, we need a White House too. And that's when he commissioned the works of Kajistuok and had him carve the Whale House. And of course, that was honoring the clan, but it was part of showing their power. So there's Southeast Alaska. You all know Southeast Alaska. Let's go a little further. This is from the top of Mount Rapinski looking south. So now we're looking down the canal. Up the canal, of course, came all of the white guys in their ships. And this is a lot about white guys and ships coming up and what the Chilkat and Chilkoot people did when they came up. Over here on this side, of course, is Chilkat Inlet. I have a feeling that most of you know this inside and out. So it's really nice to be talking to folks who really know what we're working with. I've given 12 talks in Oregon. People are fascinated, but it's brand new to them, and you guys really know what's going on here. So here at the top of Rapinski, looking down Lynn Canal, and here's the Chilkat River, of course, about 7 mile on the Haines Highway. So Chilkat Inlet's a little further down there. Here's from the top of Chili Ridge near Mount Kashagnak, a little bit west of Rapinski on the same range, looking down into the Chilkat Valley. Now, I want you to remember this. So put it in your brains and remember it, because a little later on, we're going to look at a little sketch out of John Muir's journal, original sketch that's kind of messed up, that looks at this with glaciers coming down in 1879. So keep in mind, there's the Kicking Horse, here's the Chilkat, the Taukeen is up there. And here on the other side of the area, the Chilkoot, this is a picture that was taken around the turn of the century. Of course, fishing platforms are out there. Chilkoot Lake is just beyond, and Chilkoot Village was just, a few hundred yards down from the lake. So this gives you a sense of it. And of course, these little guys are a big reason that the Chilkat and Chilkoot people were such wealthy, powerful folks. Hooligan. And we still have hooligan runs going up most of the major rivers, or some of the major rivers along the northwest coast. George Lewis, one of the elders who talked to me early on, told the story about his grandfather who had been a packer in the Klondike Gold Rush. And he said that, his grandfather was carrying between 120 and 150 pounds. And he would be paid in gold dust. He would take the gold dust back over from Skagway, take it back over to Chilkoot. He would trade the gold dust for hooligan oil, and then he would pack it up the other side, up the Chilkat, and go into the Yukon, and he got about 50% better price than he would have for gold. Because lipids in the far north you're going to die if you don't have lipids. Gold, that's not going to keep you alive. Hooligan oil, that'll keep you warm. And it's just a smokehouse in Klukwan. Good red salmon, sockeye hanging out there. And here is my first informant, the first person who helped me kind of along the way. This is Austin Hammond. One day in 1993, I went to his house, and because he had said, come over to the place sometime and I'll teach you a little Tlingit. So I thought, okay, that's a good opportunity. So I went over here, and Austin sat me down on the chair, and he said, okay, listen to me. And he spoke Tlingit to me for 5 minutes, and he said, okay, say that back. And I struggled, and he says, you can't get it. So he tried again. He spoke for 5 minutes. He said, say that back. And we did that for about an hour until my head was like exploding. And I had to go off, do something, some errand or something. But I saw that the chilkat blanket and the shakiyat just sitting on a over chair, stuffed chair, and said, would you mind putting that on and sitting next to the window? And he said, no problem. And he did that, and I took that shot, and about 6 months later, he was gone. But this is a really powerful picture to me, and there are pictures of Austin Hammond that you can find them online or go all over the place. Many of them are him speaking. He was a great orator, very powerful, persuasive person, but I just feel really good about this picture when I look at it. So, and here's another one of my informants. He's still with us. I think Joe Hotch is 88 this year, or 89. And Austin was the Chilkoot side. Joe is the Chilkat side. And he's been really helpful talking. I will say one thing that Joe reminded me of that I've heard him say a number of times. And he warned me about this when I started doing this project. He said, just be careful about words. Words are like a long stick. You never know who they will hit. And I think about this right now with you folks, because some of you might hear a word and go, wait a minute, that doesn't hit me right, or maybe it hits me right, but words are going to affect you. And Joe taught me that, and it's a good thing to know for a speech teacher. And here's Al Morgan, another person who talked to me quite a bit. Unfortunately, Al just passed away a couple of months ago. He stood up at a talk one night at the Sheldon Museum when I was talking about migration, and he said, well, everybody here should know who I am because I'm related to Long Ago Man. And Long Ago Man, some of you may know, there was a young Tlingit hunter who about 800 years ago or so, maybe a little less, was hiking up Chilkat Pass, went up to a glacier and fell into a crevasse, and was found 15 years ago or so by some hunters up there. And Al Morgan said they had done a DNA test, and he was one of the closest relatives. But then he stood and looked around everybody and said, and I still can't get a date in this town. See, this is the great stuff. Now I get to put that in the book because after migration, I can have a punchline from Al, or I can say something from Joe because, here are the descendants of those people who met John Muir, and they get to be the humorists in this book. They get to tell the jokes, or they get to express the sorrow. But either way, the generation down the line from John Muir gets the last say in this book. Lonnie Hotch, probably a number of you know her. She's alive and well out in Klukwan. She's also an informant and worked closely with this book. She reviewed the book for me. And here's Pete and Dixie Johnson. I have a feeling that many of you know some of these people, or at least a few of them. Pete and Dixie were very, very dear people, and they guided me along the process. Dixie gave me my Tlingit name, Shtuwuka, She said that means idea guy. And she was very sweet, and they spent a lot of time with me, shepherding me through this process. And there's Ed Warren. He's the guy who said, I need coffee and cookies here. And he should know, he's a corporate guy. So, as I mentioned, in the early 1800s, the headman out at Klukwan, Hetsuwu, said that he wanted something to honor his clan, the Ganaktedi, and to also establish Klukwan as a power spot. And so he commissioned the artist Kajistuok to come up from Wrangell with his family, and they carved the fabulous Whale House collection, part of which is shown here. Hopefully people have a chance to go to Klukwan and see the Whale House collection. It's quite amazing. For me, it's like stepping into the King Tut's tomb exhibit. You can really feel a lot in that room. So Klukwan was asserting its power, and that's the purpose of this, because during this time and during this study, basically I'm looking at 150 years or so, Klukwan asserted its power. Whether it was true or perceived is irrelevant. Because as a rhetorician, as a debate coach, whether facts are true or perceived is irrelevant. Now, don't think that I'm just an unethical debate coach like all the rest, but there is a way that you present yourself, and among the Chilkat and Chilkoot people, they presented themselves as very, very strong and very much self-possessed. In fact, they were so strong and they had such an ideal defensive area with Lynn Canal that they essentially kept out all of the white forerunners until finally John Muir in 1879 made a landing there. I mean, they didn't keep them out completely. Of course, they traded with ships and that sort of thing. But white people were not allowed to settle in the upper Lynn Canal. They simply couldn't. And in some cases, they weren't even allowed to land. They would do all their business out on the ship, and then, they would sail away. But they wanted their area in the upper Lynn Canal to be a place that was still under their complete control. And so there were no missionaries. In 1879, they were perhaps the last Native American group on the continent, of course, on the continent, that had not met a missionary yet. They had not suffered a military attack. There had been military people who had come up there. There had been traders. There had been some violence. There had been some guns and whatnot. But it hadn't been the cannons and the full-on attacks that had gone on with other villages like Cake and Angoon. And plus, Klukwan, as the mother village, some people call it, was the only coastal Tlingit village that was not on the coast. It was 20 miles up the river. And so, as Judson Brown said, when he was, I didn't interview him, I looked at an oral history of his, he said, the Klukwan people were very good at quarantine and keeping people out of the upper part of the valley because you had to get permission and go through the steps and pass through Yendastucky, which was the village that was at the airport today. So it was difficult to get to Klukwan, and it was difficult for disease to get to Klukwan, for guns to get to Klukwan, for military, etc., and for missionaries too. And so when John Muir came there in 1879, he was coming into a largely culturally and ecologically intact people. They only knew about white people from the few ships that would come up a little bit every now and then and interact with them. And they also knew about white people from Sitka because, they were interacting with people in Sitka and that sort of thing. Here's the Davidson Glacier in about 1890. Of course, most of you know the Davidson Glacier. When John Muir came there, the Davidson Glacier was about 150 yards from the from the tide line. And here's the top of Mount Riley, looking down at Chilkat Inlet. That island right there, of course, what's the name of that island? Pyramid Island. But there have been several other names for that island. The French, I can't remember the French name right now, but the British called it Sandy Island. In fact, George Davidson identified it as Sandy Island. It was also called God's Island by the Russians, but somewhere along the line it got changed to Pyramid Island. And just on the outside of Pyramid Island here, I guess that's me doing that. On the outside of Pyramid Island here is where most of the trade took place. And so the ships would come, they would hang out here, and then canoes would greet them from the far shore over there, and then they would trade kind of on the deep side of Pyramid Island. I better not wave that so much over there. I'll wave it over here to see what happens on this side. So that's where the trade was going on. So this is a white man's rendition of a Tlingit shaman. This book is also about the transition in spirituality in Southeast Alaska. It's a lot about missionaries and them trying to move in. And of course, they got a lot of mileage from pictures like this, because the missionaries used, especially the Presbyterian missionaries in Southeast Alaska, were attempting to enact some kind of hegemony over Southeast Alaska. In fact, they wanted all of Alaska as much as possible. And the picture of the shaman was their biggest fundraiser. They took, Sheldon Jackson toured around America with pictures of the Tlingit shaman. And he raised thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, so that they could send missionaries to what he called the darkest place on earth, to save the heathens, so to speak. And this is one of the shamans, the Icht, that is most prominent in this book, and as it interacts with John Muir. This is Skundawu. Some people called him Skundu. There's a lot about Skundawu that also relates to Juneau. He was tried here in Juneau in 1894 for murder, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. But he was one of the last medicine men in Southeast Alaska to openly oppose the missionaries. Of course, he was from Yendestucky, the airport, and he was in the Chilkat-Chilkoot area, and so it was easy for him to oppose the missionaries because there weren't any in his home. And so he got together, when he found out about the missionaries starting to come up to Southeast Alaska, he got together with Sitka Jack of Sitka, and they rode around in some war canoes around the Southeast Alaska, warning people about the missionaries. And in fact, Skundawu found that he could especially torture the missionaries. And the one person he especially loved to torture was S. Hall Young, who was John Muir's companion on his first canoe trip up. So, getting a little bit ahead here, but S. Hall Young called him the worst of the medicine men, because his method of torture was this. He would sneak into Wrangell. Then he would go to the missionary's house, which was inside the old Fort Dionysus that the Russians had built. And then he would creep underneath S. Hall Young's bedroom window. And all night long, he would make cuckoo sounds. A cuckoo sound. And he would do that until dawn, which absolutely drove S. Hall Young crazy. And he wanted him rubbed out and gotten away. I mean, maybe it says something about his blood level or something, but S. Hall Young was very, very touchy about this fellow. And he wanted him gone. And he was in the Chilkat-Chilkoot area, so he was one of the people that, with John Muir, when they got up there, they were going to convert him or chase him out or do something with him. This is a picture of Skundu in Juneau reenacting a shaman performance for Winter and Pond. And I believe this was 1906, 1907. He passed away in 1908. This is Skundu with his two brothers. Up here, over here is Kasharsk. And this is Yendayank. Yendayank was known as the Great Guide. He guided the first military mission, army mission, across Chilkoot Trail over into the Yukon. Probably some of you historically are familiar with Frederick Schwatka, who was, at the time in the late 1800s, he was America's Neil Armstrong because he had gone to the pole looking for, Sir Franklin, and he had done all kinds of amazing adventures. And Yendayank led him over the Chilkoot Pass, and then he led him up the Taku, over the Taku Inlet, or over the glacier, into BC, around, and he came out in Yakutat, Disenchantment Bay. They did a big loop, as you can imagine. That was the guide. He died at 100 years of age, and his grave is in the cemetery at Yendastucky. And there, of course, in the middle there was Skundu. This man, Charlie Jimmy, if any of you in the past saw the Chilkat dancers, the old Chilkat dancers, Karl Heimiller and those guys, Charlie Jimmy played the shaman. And I just want to say a couple of things. Of course, the shaman is not a Christian sort of situation. He considered himself a Christian man, and I asked him, how did you play the shaman for 40 years and sort of reconcile that with it? And he said, oh, that's not something we necessarily talk about a lot. But I will tell you this. He said, when I was very young, out on the Chilkoot River, the elders noticed early on that I had a very big voice. And they all told me, that's just like the shaman. The shaman has a big voice. And so when he went to Wrangell Institute as a young man, which a lot of the young Tlingit people did, his teacher there, Mrs. Tamaree, said, you have a loud voice, just like the shamans. She said, and Tamaree was her name, but she was originally Tilly Paul, right? So she was running the institute, and she was a good Christian lady, and she taught, the Bible and all that sort of thing. But off to the side, she said, I'm going to teach you how to be a shaman. Because she saw no conflict with the shaman and Christianity. The Presbyterians made up the conflict there. But as Austin said, the shaman was not necessarily like a priest. The shaman was a practitioner. The shaman, he said, gets his power when he makes a lot of noise. And so he would perform and make a lot of noise. He would call on his yik, his spirit helpers, and he would dance around. He would do all kinds of energetic work. And then he'd come back the next day and see if the patient was better. If the patient died, the shaman gave a full refund. So the shaman was not going to be, caught as the bad guy necessarily. And he was usually paid in blankets. And so Charlie Jimmy is the modern version of a shaman who played a shaman for 40 years. All right, I mentioned that I was going to talk about the eclipse just briefly. And I will say that, there's so much to say, and I'm so excited to see you guys, but I always keep thinking, don't go 4 hours. But the first couple of chapters in this book the first chapter is before the white man came. And so you get to hear from Austin and some of the elders the migration stories and the stories that they would allow me to tell. I'm not telling clan stories or family stories. I'm telling history, basically. And Austin said it was all right to talk about the migration with this. And so the migration is in the first chapter. The second chapter is about some of the early white people who came up to the area, Russians, and some of the earlier ships that went along with that. And chapter 3, as I said, is about the eclipse. It starts with this guy, George Davidson. George Davidson was British born. He was an astronomer. In 1850, he was made the Western Division Chief of the U.S. Coastal Survey, which is now NOAA. And he was sent to San Francisco in 1850, and his job was to survey the entire West Coast from south of San Diego up to as far north as he could go. And that was his primary job. So he began to survey up and down the coast. And you can imagine, he had a small started with sailing ship, and he's surveying, and it was quite a huge job that he was doing. Then the Civil War broke out in 1860, 1861, and he was sent back east by the military to draw secret maps and charts of Confederate ports. And so he secretly went to Savannah and all of the Confederate ports and drew maps and charts for them, and then he went back to the West Coast, to San Francisco. In 1867, of course, we were about to purchase Alaska from the Russians. But before we purchased Alaska, Congress sent George Davidson to Southeast Alaska and said, we want you to look around and see if it's going to be worth it for us to pay that $7.2 million. So he was the person who made the inventory that Congress looked at to see if it was worth it to purchase Alaska. So he went up in 1867 to Southeast Alaska, and at the very northern end of his trip, of course, he came up to northern Lynn Canal, and he met the Chilkat and Chilkoot people. He was very interested in that. He was kind of amazed that year they had sold 2,300 silver fox furs to British traders, which he thought was quite amazing. Where were they getting the silver fox? They were trading it down from the Yukon, of course. How were they getting it down from the Yukon? Well, they brought up this greasy little fish oil that they loved up there, and they brought the silver fox back down to the waterline and traded it. This is another character who plays into that eclipse. This was the territorial governor of Alaska. Mr. Davis was not the Confederate Davis. He was a Union Davis, and he was also the only Union general ever to be charged with murdering another general. And so they said, we've got an idea for you. Why don't you be the military governor of Alaska? So they sent him up here. And so he was along with this gentleman. They came up from Sitka. Davidson came up initially, and this was 1867. He did that, and he sent his mission back. But then while he was up in Haines, or up in at Pyramid Harbor, he determined that 2 years from then there would be a great eclipse, a solar eclipse, and that the eclipse would go all the way across the continent, from kind of the southeast corner, Georgia, South Carolina, and all the way, and the most northernmost point of perfect visibility would be Klukwan. Amazingly enough. And so he came up in 1869 as the northernmost surveyor for that great eclipse, which was happening all across America. It was quite a big deal. And there were a lot of questions about eclipses back then that still had yet to be answered. Well, when he got to Sitka, George Davidson was looking around for a way to get up to Klukwan, up to the Haines area, and it turned out that Koklux, and Koklux was the head man of Klukwan. Koklux was in jail for some contrived thing in Sitka, and Jefferson Davis brought Davidson to Koklux and said, will you take this man to Klukwan? If you do, I'll let you out of jail. And Kokluk said, I would be happy to do that. And he was so happy to do that he said, I'll take you, I'll take everything. And Davidson said, no, I won't go in your canoe. We'll take another boat instead. And so Jefferson Davis said, well, I have this one cutter you can take, and you can get up there fairly quickly. I'll give you 3 men you can take it up there with. But Davidson said, no, I don't want the cutter. What about that? And he was pointing to an 18-foot rowboat. And he said, that'll take you forever to get up there. And he said, I'm taking that. So he took the rowboat, and he had 3 surveyors with him, and Koklux and his group in their canoes took all of their equipment and led them up to Lynn Canal, and every night on the way up there, 11 nights to get to Upper Lynn Canal from Sitka, rowing. Every night, Koklux and his men would get up to a campsite early enough, they would set up camp, and they would have dinner all ready for Davidson and his men when they got there. So Davidson also, before he left Sitka, he left a little note because he'd heard that William Seward was around, and just in case William Seward came back to Sitka and wanted to go up to Klukwan, he said, please come up. We're going to see the eclipse. We'd love to have you come up. And that was it. And so Seward saw the note and said, of course we'll go up. He was in the 25-foot stainless steel boat, the Active. And it had come up all the way from San Francisco. And it was outfitted with the best cook and just beautiful facilities, but it's a small boat to come up all the way from San Francisco. But nonetheless, it did. And so he chugged his way up to Upper Lynn Canal and got into the Chilkat Inlet, and he took the 25-foot boat, the Active, all the way up the Chilkat River up to Klukwan. And they anchored just below Klukwan at 18 Mile, the 18-mile slide, and then they walked up to Klukwan, and then they saw this amazing eclipse. There's so much that I can tell you about the eclipse, but I will tell you this. At the apogee of that eclipse, at the moment when the eclipse finally was its darkest, and this is the sketch that George Davidson made. Oh, they stayed in Koklux's house. This is in Klukwan, and this was Koklux, the head man. This is his house up there. Here's the sketch. This sketch of the eclipse was first drawn on a pattern board that is still under somebody's house in Klukwan. It is still there somewhere, but nobody. I asked around. Just like anytime I'm asking, oh, where's that pattern board? Well, sit down, I'll tell you. And we never quite got to the pattern board. But just at the moment of the apogee of this moment, the Sitka natives who had accompanied Seward fell on their knees and held their Russian crosses and began praying. The Klukwan people had no idea what they were doing. They thought that they were helping the sun disappear somehow. And there are some accounts, interestingly enough, and if you look at history.com, they have an account there of the eclipse that says the Chilkat people were about ready to attack and destroy Seward and Davidson, and then the eclipse came and they ran into the woods. Not true. Not true at all. The Klukwan people were all gathered around the surveyors. They were watching the surveyors because they had this feeling that the surveyors were also causing this eclipse. And so finally at the apogee, when the Sitka people, the Kiksadi, fell to their knees, one of the Klukwan guys said, enough, enough. We know you're stronger than the Russians. Bring back the sun. And so, of course, the sun came back. The birds started singing again. Everything worked just fine. And that's the eclipse. You can read a lot more about it in the book. But let's jump ahead a little bit to a guy I've already mentioned, Sheldon Jackson. Of course, he is fairly well known in Southeast Alaska. Used to be S.J. College. He had a lot to do with Sitka and through the whole area. Before he started coming into Alaska, he had established more than 100 Presbyterian churches in the West. He was the head of the Presbyteriate of the inner Rocky Mountain area, which was everything west of the Mississippi, essentially. And so he was in his own words, a zealot for Christ who was looking for a place anywhere he could to put a Presbyterian church. And so, as I said, he raised tens of thousands of dollars going around the country telling about the horrors of the Tlingit Shaman. When he was at Union Seminary in southeastern Pennsylvania, he was speaking to the seminarians, and after his talk, a young man came up to him and was very, very moved, and he said, "I want you to send me to the darkest place on earth." And Sheldon Jackson kind of looked at him and talked to him and took his address and had a little bit of a correspondence with him. And he made friends with Samuel Hall Young. And eventually he sent Samuel Hall Young to Wrangell, which was Stikeen at the time. But first he sent this woman, Amanda McFarland. How many of you know about Amanda McFarland? Okay, there's a couple of you out there. Amanda McFarland was the wife of a missionary. She was Presbyterian. They set up the first Protestant mission in New Mexico after 400 years of Catholic hegemony. So they were kind of brave, kind of out there sort of people. Then they moved to Walla Walla to take over the Whitman mission after the massacre. And then her husband died, David, and so she caught a steamer down to Portland, down the Columbia River, and went to A.L. Lindsley, who was the head of the Presbyterian Church in downtown Portland, and she said, "Take me to the darkest place on earth." There was kind of a competition, I guess. And so he said, "All right," this was 1878, or 1877, "I'll send you to the Stikeen, to Wrangell." Because in the few years leading up to that time, the Cassiar gold rush had brought hundreds of white miners to the Stikeen village. Prior to that, they had met some Russians. The Russians had built Fort Dionysus, but the chaos didn't really happen until all the gold miners showed up. And the gold miners had their side of Wrangell, the kind of north end closer to the Stikeen River, and that was foreigner town or international town where most of the gold miners were. And then the southern end was more the traditional people. Well, A.L. Lindsley wanted to send Mrs. McFarland up there immediately because the young Tlingit ladies were being absconded for sex trade. And so he sent what he called 200 pounds of fighting joy up to Southeast Alaska because she could handle the situation. And she went up there with Sheldon Jackson on the SS California. He introduced her to Tawat, who was the headman in Stikeen, and he was also the first to become Christianized, and he was the leader of a small group of his family, basically, the Christians of the village. Introduced her to them, and then they put her up, and then she immediately went into foreigner town and proceeded with an axe to break down the doors of the miners, go in, grab the young lady, pull her out, and take her to Mrs. McFarland's industrial school for training young women, in which they learned to wear lace and, kind of the Victorian lady sort of thing. So she was up there first. And then the next year, of course, came Samuel Hall Young, S. Hall Young. And he was a little stricter than most of the Presbyterians. See, Sheldon Jackson's policy for Native Americans had been when you establish a mission, you write a very brief dictionary of that language and you use it in your services. This is what the policy had been for the Presbyterians. Samuel Hall Young said that that is like preaching with the words of the devil. I am not going to learn Tlingit, which he described in all kinds of nasty ways. I am going to bring them to God rather than God going out to the unwashed. And so he was the beginning of the no Tlingit law right there. And that was the beginning. So you cannot blame all Presbyterians with one wash because their national policy was to write a dictionary. But He did not believe in that. So 1878 is when he went to Wrangell, and he built the mission, and manned it, developed it, and then along came this guy. Well, let's just pause here for a moment. John Muir, of course, born in Scotland, in 1838. When he was 9 years old, his family sailed for America. Why did they sail for America? It wasn't for riches necessarily. It was for religious freedom. Because his father, Daniel Muir, had been a member of the Church of Scotland, which was like the Church of England, and then had become disgusted with the Church of Scotland because there were too many wealthy people in there, broke away and became a Campbellite. And the Campbellites were under the direction of Alexander Campbell, who went across the countryside preaching and said, you don't need churches to preach in because the Spirit of God is right inside of you. You just go out on any street corner and preach the way you want because we are the evangelists. And between, in the 1850s, 300,000 Scots left for the U.S., mostly because they were seeking religious freedom, and they became the first evangelicals. Those people who said every word in the Bible should be revered and is exactly as it means. Those were the people. That was his father, Daniel Muir. And eventually they settled in central Wisconsin, the wilds of Wisconsin, and Daniel Muir, as the oldest son, was charged with 20 hours of work a day. Their family got up at 4 in the morning and went to work in the fields, John Muir leading them, while Daniel Muir, the father, went about the countryside evangelizing. That's what he did. There were 3 sons, 4 daughters, and they went out and did most of the work. There's a lot that I could say about John Muir's early life, but relating to 3 things, 3 aspects of his life that I kind of follow through this book. One is his religion, and you have a sense of his religion right now. He was raised in a very, very strict evangelical upbringing. He had the Old Testament memorized by the time he was 10 years old. Second is his attitude about Native Americans. And as they developed their farm in central Wisconsin, they also developed an attitude about Native Americans. You know, in Scotland, he had romanticized Native Americans. But then in central Wisconsin, he changed his attitude about them because oftentimes he thought they would come by and try to steal things, or they weren't particularly well washed in the way that he would want. Muir was really a stickler for being as clean as possible. Anybody who wasn't absolutely well washed was suspect. So his relationship with Native Americans, and then third, his public speaking ability. And as a public speaking teacher, I was very interested in kind of developing that. Well, so early in his life, all of these things were developing. He had basically the same biases and prejudices that mainstream America did about Native Americans. Public speaking wasn't even in the picture at that point. Religiously, yeah, here's something interesting. So only one book was allowed in the household, and that was the Bible, the Old Testament. But John Muir was a reader. He wanted to read as much as possible. And even some of the other Campbellite families in the area saw the remarkable genius of this young man, and they started sneaking him books. These other evangelicals were sneaking him those dirty old Greeks and Romans and, those kinds of people. And so Muir was reading those, and one night his father was putting everybody to bed, or, the bell rang. It's like, go to bed now, 7 p.m., and Muir said, one more page. I just got to get one more page. What are you reading? And he said, I'm reading the lives of the ancient Greeks. And his father threw a fit and said, you're going to bed with the rest of the family. And he said, all right, but I need to read. And he said, you can go to bed with the rest of the family, but you can get up anytime you want. And so Muir started waking up at 1 a.m. And This happened when he was about 17 years of age. He left home when he was about 25, 26, and so for all that time he was getting up at 1 a.m. How did he get up at 1 a.m.? They didn't have alarm clocks. They didn't have smartphones that could wake you up with the sound of an ocean or something like that. How did he get up? Well, he used his genius there, and he worked. The first thing he worked on, or one of the first things that he worked on, was the early rising bed, in which there were cogs and wheels under the bed and straps and a candle. And when the candle burned through a bit of twine, the bed would stand up and he would fall out. And that was the early rising bed. He was a genius, really. He was an engineering genius. Keep this in mind when you're thinking about left brain, right brain. He wasn't a namby-pamby poet or writer of history or anything like that. He could actually build amazing things. He built a huge thermometer on the side of their barn that people could see for miles. And a clock. He loved carving clocks out of a single piece of wood. I mean, he was really quite an engineering genius. And so the neighbors saw this and they said, you ought to take one of your early rising beds to the county fair. So he did, went to Madison, Wisconsin. He won first prize, $15, and that was enough to enter him in the first term of college at University of Wisconsin at Madison. And he went there, and he gained other friends. He got a little bit more money. He was able to attend college for 2.5 years, and then he left in the middle of the Civil War. 1863 or so, he left Wisconsin. He said he was going for a long botanizing ramble across Canada. Well, chances are maybe he was running from the draft or something. But nonetheless, he disappeared into Canada. And he got other jobs. He worked for quite a while, almost a year, at a broomstick fashioning factory in Canada until that burned down. Finally, in 1865, or just a little bit, almost 1866, after the war had closed down, he got back into the U.S. He walked into Indianapolis, and he got a job as an engineer in a carriage wheel manufacturing factory. And he worked at these carriage wheels, and one day in 66, he was sharpening the edge of a carriage, or a file rather, and a bit of the file went into his eye, his right eye. And immediately it went blind. And his left eye went blind too, sympathetically. And so he was led back to the boarding house, or the room he was staying at, and he was put into the bed, into this dark room, and he laid in there for a month, completely blind. You can imagine if that was you, and you had been an engineer, and you had loved the world for what it was, and now you are blind and wondering where your life is going to lead you. Well, a month later, his eyesight returned. But at that point, he decided, no longer am I going to be a man of factories. I am going to set out and find out what the real world looks like. And so he took his first big long walk, his 1,000-mile walk down to Florida. Now, this is where another theme in the book comes up, related to Native Americans. As John Muir walked to Florida from Indianapolis, in his journals, and I've read his journals, he mentions Native Americans once. And that is when he comes to a Cherokee impoundment, a fence where the Cherokees were put in on their walk on the Trail to Tears. It is empty. There's no one there. He just writes a Cherokee impoundment, nothing else. But also, as he walked across America in this way, he came to places that had been sacred sites, that had been villages, that had been hunting grounds, where now nobody was there. Now there were whites and free men, former slaves, with their small houses. And they were living in these places, but there were vast stretches where Native Americans had been before, where there was nothing but swamp or woods. And this was the beginning of Muir's concept of wilderness. Wilderness without people. And the Wilderness Act of 1964 declared that a wilderness would have no permanent inhabitants in it, that the federal government in Washington, D.C. would be the stewards of wilderness. It was a new concept. Wilderness, of course, is in the Bible as a place that you go that the devil lives, and there's all kinds of awful things in the wilderness. But John Muir, for the first time, was seeing wilderness as a positive, beautiful thing as long as there were no people there, which was a very contradictory sort of thing for a Native American to be thinking about. Well, Muir finally got to Florida. He was about ready to go to Amazon. He got sick, decided there was too much sickness in the Amazon. He found a little newspaper clipping about the Central Sierras in California, and he decided he would go there. He wanted to see real wilderness and tromp through vast areas of wilderness. He got to California. He went to what is now Yosemite. 12 years before he had arrived, the Ahwahneechee band of the Miwok people had lived in Yosemite Valley. And they had harvested acorns from trees that they had taken care of for hundreds of years. Now there was no one. They had been run out by the brigades that had gone up and down the Central Sierras, killing and slaughtering and dispossessing Native Americans of their lands. So when Muir got to Yosemite, he found no one. And you know what he said? It was like the dawning of a new day in Eden. The concept of Eden became intertwined with wilderness as a purity standard, right? How pure can wilderness be? Is it pure if you run a chainsaw? Nope. Can't run a chainsaw in wilderness areas unless you have special dispensation. So he got this idea, and he loved the Yosemite. He hiked all the way around through there. However, when he saw Native American people in the area, sometimes he would, in fact, there's one stretch where he's up on a high peak and he's watching Paiute Indians going over to the east side, over to the Mono side. And he calls them ugly, wallowing beasts because they were ruining his perfect wilderness. And then in the next paragraph, he turns to a flower and writes 2 paragraphs about how beautiful the flower is. So we're seeing something a little different maybe than necessarily the legend of John Muir. Although I'm sure he was a good guy and everything else, but he had his prejudices, like most of America did at that time. So he began to develop a theory about glaciers after being in Yosemite. Many of you know this theory. He thought that ice had existed in the Central Sierras. Well, the head geologist in California at the time had just written a book that's saying that Yosemite was formed from subsidence and catastrophe, and that there had been great floods and huge boulders had come loose from the mountains and washed through Yosemite Valley, making the walls absolutely clean with those boulders. That's the way Yosemite Valley was formed. John Muir disagreed. He thought it was glaciers, and he walked around looking for one last glacier somewhere in Yosemite, and he was able to find it eventually. But he began to speak, and this is where his public speaking ability comes in. He was very much afraid of public speaking. As one of his friends said, John Muir reminded him of other men who had spent a long time by themselves in the wilderness. They had a lot of well-digested opinions and attitudes about a remarkable number of things, but you could hardly shut them up. He didn't have his social cues down. He hadn't been interacting with people on a, well, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. No, he'd been all by himself talking to the birds and whatnot. So he loved to talk nonstop, but he was afraid of public speaking. But he was living with a family who had encouraged him to go out there and speak because he could make some money. So he got an offer to speak at Yosemite Valley at a National Presbyterian Conference in June of 1879. More than 300 people came on the train from the East Coast to Yosemite Valley. And he rose up and spoke. Sheldon Jackson spoke first in the small Yosemite chapel there. And then actually after Sheldon Jackson, Josiah Whitney, who was the geologist, one of his spokespersons spoke up about subsidence and earthquakes and how Yosemite had been formed. And then John Muir spoke up. And an article in the San Francisco paper described John Muir as altogether unremarkable. He was a shabby gentleman, kind of hunched as he walked toward the front, toward the days in the front. And then he began to speak about glaciers, and as he spoke, he rose up, his voice got louder, he became very animated, and he spoke not for 4 hours, he spoke for about 2.5 hours, which was quite a long time. But he was absolutely entrancing to the audience, and for the first time, really, people were amazed by this young man, John Muir. So after his speech, he got back, and Sheldon Jackson started talking to him, and Sheldon Jackson said, well, you know where the glaciers are, they're in Alaska. And Muir said, yeah, someday I hope to get up there. And Sheldon Jackson says, well, I'm taking some other missionaries up there in 10 days. Why don't you join us? And he said, okay, I will. So that is how John Muir got to Alaska. Now, he was going to spend that summer in Martinez with Louie, his fiancée, and her family. But the first time they heard from him was a letter marked July 2nd, 1869 from Fort Wrangell. So he had skipped all of the niceties there and just jumped on the boat and went right to Fort Wrangell. He was going up to Fort Wrangell with Sheldon Jackson, and Sheldon Jackson was also bringing 2 other missionaries and their wives up there because they had decided they wanted to see this first mission in Wrangell, and they had pooled their money together because they were also going to go to the major target, the darkest of the dark spots, the Chilkat territory. So they had all the missionaries had put in extra money for the coal and the fuel that would get their boat from Wrangell up to Chilkat. And so they were very excited about that. And so they all jumped in there, the Devines and John Muir. And by the way, for any of you who are interested in weird little history bits, actually 2 things, since I'm spending quite a bit of time in Oregon these days. The steamship captain of the Cassiar that was taking them up there was a guy named Nat Lane, who was the son of Joseph Lane, who was the governor of Oregon. The other interesting thing that you might be find, and maybe some of you know this, but there was an article in a journal about 10 years ago, an academic journal written by a scholar that talked about the major 6 hooligan routes. The northernmost route was the Chilkat River. The southernmost route for the hooligan was the Columbia River. And in his scholarly work, I was dumbfounded when I saw that when Lewis and Clark came to Fort Clatsop and asked the local people, what do you call this place? They said, Ulican. They heard Oregon. Oregon is named after a greasy little fish. So anyway, so the Devines were in the Cassiar heading north. You know, they had taken a look at Stikine. Now they're heading north, and they're going to go convert all of the heathen Chilkats with John Muir. But then one of the engines kind of craps out on them. And the other engine's going, but it's shaking a lot. And they keep putting more fuel in there. And then finally he said, well, it's going to take us 2 more days to get to Chilkat. And then the missionaries met, and they say, we don't have enough time and money. We'll have to leave. And so they turned around, and they went back to Wrangell. And John Muir was very upset because he really wanted to see the Davidson Glacier. The Davidson Glacier was the most famous Alaskan glacier at the time, because it was along the steamship route. As you went up there, some of the steamships had taken pictures of it. People hadn't really spent much time in Glacier Bay, or really wasn't known that much. And Davidson Glacier was in a lithograph in many newspapers. And so he wanted to see Davidson Glacier. Well, he couldn't see it because they turned around. So eventually the missionaries went back down south. Muir stuck around. They did a lot of hiking, him and S. Hall Young. They went up the Stikine a bit. All sorts of other things happened. Finally, it's October 12th. We know what October looks like around here. It's October 12th. And finally, Hall Young says, okay, we can take our voyage to the Chilkat territory. And Tawat, his church leader person, the head man, we were going to use his canoe. And they had 3 other Tlingit gentlemen with them. Stikine Johnny, who was a young man who was their translator. Sitka Charlie, who was Sitka Jack's son. If you go to the cottage cemetery in Sitka, you see Sitka Jack and Sitka Charlie buried in the same family plot. And then Kadashan. Kadashan was a great orator, a really good speaker, and he was also known as the peacemaker. And so they were the crew, and then S. Hall Young and John Muir were in there, and they took off. They were getting ready to take off in their canoe that morning of October 12th. And I just want to read you just a little bit here, because we haven't heard a lot from the women in this. There's kind of a lot of guys in this thing. But there's a great moment here when the women have the say. And let me see if I can find that here for a moment. Okay. Here we go. So the canoe is down on the beach in front of Wrangell. The boys are all getting ready. They're stuffing the canoe full of their goodies, Muir and Young and the 4 Tlingit men. And they're about ready to go. A knot of frowning women materialized nearby. Kadashan's mother, a woman of great natural dignity and force of character, marched down the steps to the beach and across the tidal mud to the canoe. She fixed her dark, bodeful eyes on Reverend Young with an intensity that presaged a red-hot upbraiding. With great solemnity and gesture, the woman accused Young of using undue influence to persuade her son into believing that such a foolhardy excursion was God's will. Did Young truly believe that God would save them from horrible weather and hostile rivals? Because, of course, the Chilkats were very big rivals for the Stikine people up there, so they were worried about that as well. Like an ancient sibyl, Kadashan's mother detailed an array of dangers awaiting the party, predicting disaster at every turn. At the conclusion of her speech, she paused, locked a fatal gaze on Young, and swore her oath. If my son comes not back, on you will be his blood, and you shall pay. Young raised his hand, as if to catch or bless her threat. He was on a mission for the Lord. She should remember that they traveled in the protective light of an all-knowing God who gave his only son for her. The Reverend pledged himself to care for Kadashan as if he were his own son, and if need be, quote-unquote, die in his defense. We shall see whether or not you die, she snapped. And then the other women step up, and they also give them a real upbraiding. So, these guys are off for a jaunt in October with the nicest canoe, with the strongest men. They may not come back. There's a lot resting on this trip, as you can imagine. And Muir and Young, they're just happy. They're on a lark. Finally, they're going to go see glaciers. Finally, they're going to go convert hostiles. We're off on our big adventure here. And as you can see, I think my next... Oh, just a few Muir pictures. Yeah, Muir's a famous guy. He's on a stamp. And he's on a T-shirt, too. Back to Southeast Alaska. So here we have, they're starting in Stikine, and they go underneath Cake there. You can kind of see that line there. They go up through Rocky Pass. They stop in Cake first, and then they go up over here. Actually, they go on the Angoon side. They go over to Hoona. They go up into Glacier Bay. You can see that there. So they are going, and they're going to be sermonizing in all the villages. Well, all these villages before had met God's men. They had met missionaries. They knew about missionaries there. And they wanted missionaries because if you got a missionary, the headman also got a new house. And you got a church. So there was a lot of incentive, plus more traders would come to your village. And now that they were part of America, they wanted those rich Boston traders to come to their villages. So of course they were going to convert. And as they went up in their canoe, we're talking a 22-foot yellow cedar canoe, right? In October with 6 guys in it and all their gear. So as they're going up, they run into all kinds of rain and storms and all sorts of things. I talk about it here in the book. And in fact, there's much in the book, everything in the book about the trip itself is not in Muir's Travels in Alaska. So I'm not just repeating Travels in Alaska. The notes on the journey there are from his unpublished journals. And there's a lot in his unpublished journals about that trip that he breezed over when he wrote Travels in Alaska 25 years later. He didn't write it like the next day as soon as he got back to California. He sat on it for years and years and years. And in fact, Muir died Christmas 1913 with the manuscript to Travels in Alaska on his bedstand. And the pages from the chapter in the Country of the Chilkats on his chest. So that was the last book he wrote. And so his journal entries that I use in this book, many of them talk a lot about the rich native culture and give individual names to people and quotes the individuals. None of that is in the book. So you're going to find out a lot about the Tlingit people that he met along the way as you go into this. By the way, those journals are now available online. In fact, almost all of his chicken scratchings and all of that is available online. It's through University of the Pacific in Stockton, California, John Muir Archives. You can find it, and you can look into all of his journals, many of which have been transcribed because it's kind of hard to read his writing. It's amazing if you want to get into that stuff. It's really terrific. So now you've been refreshed with the voyage, and they go up there. Of course, they're trying to get to Glacier Bay. This is a nice photo from my friend Kim Hecox, and this is Glacier Bay in October. And so they go into Glacier Bay in October. Here's another thing about John Muir's relationship with the Native Americans. There is a lot of tension because Muir, as soon as wherever they land, Muir disappears, right? You probably know somebody like that. It's like, I'm going to go up this route. Bye. And he might not come back for 3 or 4 hours. And so the Tlingits are sitting around going, where is this guy? I mean, doesn't he know there's a storm coming? Doesn't he know that we can't camp here, that we're going to have to camp up here? You know, all those kinds of things that you would be thinking too if you were in that situation. So the tension was building and building and building. And when they got into Glacier Bay, it was a place that those Tlingits didn't want to go in the first place. Why would they want to go there? There's no food there. Yeah, there's a few seals, but that's it. And who would go in there in October? Certainly not them. And so whenever they landed, they were there for a week, and they would land someplace, they would set camp, and Muir would go by, not even by, he'd just go, and he would disappear. In the mornings, he would wake up well before dawn and not come home until midnight. He would instruct his people to build a huge fire so he could figure out where camp was from the top of some mountain, wherever he might be. So here they are and here, and the natives are getting restless. They are tired of him wandering off and not coming home till late. In fact, one time when he finally comes back way late, he says, "Oh, I'm so glad I saw that fire. I was deep inside of a glacier, and I saw a little reflection on a piece of ice. And I thought, oh, this is not the way. I have to turn around and go back out. Your fire saved me from the bottom of that glacier." And they're like, get a load of this guy. So they accused him of being a witch at one point. They said, "No way are we going to travel with you. We're out of here." And then Muir said, "Look, for 10 years I've been hiking in Yosemite, and good luck has always followed me." And he gave them that kind of a sermon. And Kadashan says, "Well, I like traveling with good luck people." And Tawat finally says, "Well, it's my canoe, but if we go down, you go down, and I want to die with my missionary. So let's go. I'll get to heaven faster, right?" So they go into Glacier Bay, and they have this experience in Glacier Bay. And finally, on Halloween of 1879, they leave Glacier Bay, and they come around Point Couverton, and they start heading north up to the Chilkats. And 3 days later, and there's north winds against them, so they're paddling against the wind going north. Several days later, they come to Davidson Glacier. This is the sketch in Muir's journals of Davidson Glacier when they got there. Of course, it's a bird's eye sketch. He wasn't up there. But there's their little canoe in the corner. You can see that. And you can just see that little strip of vegetation at that spot. Well, they stopped at the glacier. They pulled off to the side there. And Muir was dying to get on that glacier and start running around. But he reported that it was basically a wall of vegetation. He didn't have enough time to get through that wall. And then on the other side next to the glacier, it was deep mud, and he couldn't do that either. So he just sat and fidgeted, basically, while the other members of his crew were putting on their finest clothing, putting on spectacles, and putting on perfume and all sorts of things. And Muir said, "Having nothing fine, I stuck an eagle feather in my cap." And he said, "Why are you dressing up?" "Well, we're dressing up because the Chilkat people are very fine people, and we want to be able to represent ourselves correctly." And you might remember Al Morgan, who I showed you, who was the relative of Long Ago Man. He said, they weren't getting dressed up for the Chilkat people. They were getting dressed up to die. That's what was happening. And so they began to paddle that last half day to get to Yendestucky. Let's see. There we go. And they got to Yendestucky, which is the airport in Haines. And there were about 150 people living there. That was the Guardian Village. That was the village. You know, the other Chilkat and Chilkoot villages were back up someplace. Chilkoot village was not on the water, not on the ocean. Chilkat was not on the ocean. But Yendestucky, they could tell who was coming up. And so Muir spent 5 days there with S. Hall Young, and they proceeded to have tent revival meetings, missionary meetings, starting at 8 o'clock in the morning. And according to Muir, sometimes they went as late as midnight, all day long. They would start off with Young, the missionary. He would start preaching, and then Tawat would come in, and Tawat would preach as he was the newly converted. And then the other three Tlingit gentlemen, one was translating. The other two would also lead hymns and prayers and that sort of thing, and they would just rotate around. Well, Muir felt very uncomfortable with this, because, as you recall, he had been raised in a very strict evangelical family, and he had the Old Testament memorized. But as he had become an adult, he had considered himself more of a transcendentalist. he had read the works of Henry David Thoreau, and he had met Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he believed that God's mystery was manifest in nature and the undersoul rather than the Old Testament. And he had fairly much converted himself to that way of thinking. And so for him to travel with a missionary was a pretty big stretch, because he didn't even like missionaries. He considered them part of the reason that Native Americans were fallen from grace and were not ecologically and culturally whole anymore because of the missionaries. But he made friends with S. Hall Young, and he allowed them to do their mission work. Well, Muir didn't say a word during these tent revival meetings. He sat in the dark corner of the headman's house, the big house, and he never said a word. So, the last night that they were there, Muir had hardly said anything. I mean, late at night, they would ask him to stand up and talk, and they would ask him natural history questions. And he would they would say, how can birds fly? And so he would explain birds flying. They said, what about tides rising and tides falling? What's that about? And so he would explain as best he could about tides rising and falling. They said, what about that eclipse? They showed us with the apple and orange, but we don't believe that. What about that eclipse? And then Muir confirmed the apple and orange and the light idea and showed them the eclipse. But then the last question they asked him was, why do you walk on glaciers? We avoid them. Why do you go to glaciers? And he, of course, rhapsodized about that as well as he could. And he gave a speech. And he has the one sermon that you could say he ever gave. Finally, that last night, they said, stand up, tell us about nature, but also tell us about this big man that the missionary people keep telling us about. And so Muir gave one speech, and this is probably the only sermon he was ever known to give. Oh, there's so much more I could say, but we've got to keep moving along here. Then I spoke of the brotherhood of man, how we were all children of one Father, sketched the characteristics of the different races of mankind, showing that no matter how far apart their countries were, how they differed in color, size, language, etc., and no matter how different and how various the ways in which they got a living, that the white man and all the people of the world were essentially alike, and that we all had 10 fingers and 10 toes, and our bodies were the same, whether white, brown, black, or different colors, and we speak different languages. We were all the same. And in that speech, Muir introduced a word that they had never heard a white man speak before: brotherhood. Essentially, he removed the top-down hierarchy where the captain and everybody else, and he put everybody on the same level. He said, we are all brothers of the same God. And that was very, very interesting to the Tlingits for a number of reasons. But then finally, the old shaman, Skundawoo's brother, stood up, and he responded. And what did he say, you're wondering? Well, he said this: I am an old man, but I am glad to hear these strange things you tell, and they may well be true, for what is more wonderful than the flight of birds in the air? I remember the first white man I ever saw. Since that long, long ago time, I have seen many, but never until now have I ever truly known and felt a white man's heart. All the white men I have heretofore met wanted to get something from us. They wanted furs, and they wished to pay for them as small a price as possible. They all wish to be seeking their own good, not our good. I might say in all my life, I have never until now heard a white man speak. It has always seemed to me that while trying to talk to traders and those seeking gold mines, that it was like talking to a person across a broad stream that was running fast over stones and making so loud a noise that scarce a single word could be heard. But now, for the first time, the Indian and the white man are on the same side of the river, eye to eye, heart to heart. Now that's a different kind of speech than we are used to hearing. But those Tlingits are very eloquent people. And this was a response to the idea of brotherhood, of we are seeking the good for all of us. Because, of course, tribal people don't try to stand out on their own. Tribal people are first committed to the tribe itself. And possibly that is why Muir was allowed to be, or at least liked at that point. So the next day after that speech, they had one last day in the Haines area, and the headman, Donawak, took the missionary and his people out around what is now downtown Haines. And they said, we're going to give you a piece of land for you to build your mission. So it was based on that final Muir speech that they said, okay, you can have a mission in Jilkat Ani, in our territory. And so they walked around there and they said, go ahead and pick a spot. And so they did. And except that Muir didn't go with them that day. In fact, Skunduwu was with them. They walked around the whole area. Muir instead decided, like a lot of people do these days, that he would run up Mount Rapinski. And so he got about 2,400 feet up Mount Rapinski, and he was looking back up the Chilkat Valley. And remember that picture I had a while back of the Chilkat Valley today? Now you can see the glaciers coming down. The Kicking Horse Glacier is right there. It's not called the Kicking Horse. What's it called? It's Garrison. Garrison Glacier is coming down on that side, and you can see other glaciers up there. And so they chose their land. They chose where the mission was going to be. And Ed Warren gets also the punchline in this one. They chose downtown Haines, and many of you know where that is. Ed Warren says, perfect place for a white man town. White men love their views. Why weren't there any Tlingits there? Ask the wind. Ask the snow. Ask the no fish that live there. That's why Tlingit people didn't live there. So they chose that as Haines, and the rest, as they say, is history. This is Sally Burriton. She is the scribe. She is Austin's scribe, and she was the one who finally told me the story, much of which I haven't even told you tonight. There's some really great stuff about when they meet in there. This is her in her fish spot right along the Chilkat River, just down from Klukwan. This is a sketch from Pete Andreessen. Maybe some of you knew him. He was an artist who lived in Haines a number of years. And this is the moment, he calls this the meeting, where the canoe with Muir was coming to Yendestucky and being met by the Tlingit people there. This is the Chilkat River with Tlingit fishing canoes out there. And, they were... I love seeing those sails out there. Six months, well, a couple of little things. We'll end this, we'll wrap this up, and this will take me it won't take me 6 months. It'll take me 8 minutes. So Muir, on the way back down from his first trip in Southeast Alaska, he first lands in Portland, because there's no Seattle at that time. And Portland is where it's at. They come into Portland, and already The town is abuzz. John Muir is here. Now he's starting to gain some authority, that sort of thing. They're starting to know who he is. And he has 4 speaking dates already established at the YMCA and other places all around town. The Chamber of Commerce has got him in there. He's going to give 4 speeches. What did you see in Alaska? At each one of those speeches, he draws on a blackboard a big map of the West. Down here is California. He draws where the gold strike was at Sutter's Mill. And then he draws all the way up to the Yukon, and he shows a vein of gold that goes from Sutter's Mill to the Yukon. A mineralized vein. I won't say a vein of gold, a mineralized vein. And he says there's no reason to believe that the gold that was found in Sutter's Mill doesn't exist in the Yukon as well. And hardly had he got those words out of his mouth when the crowd started emptying out of the auditoriums. They were on their way to Alaska. We're going to go up there right away. And that is my theory, basically. He was the first one to talk about this area in the Upper Lynn Canal. He also mentioned, the mountains are there and the miners can make them as they will. And the hostile Chilkats have been mollified, and you are welcome there. Muir opened up the North and began that gold rush. He went to California and gave the same speech several other places. And that year, the 1st Army Battalion went over the Chilkoot Trail, 1880. And a few months later, these 2 people showed up in Haines. This is Mr. and Mrs. Willard, the Missionaries. Now they are going to build an official mission. And there's a lot that I could say about that, but we'll just move it right along. And you can read the book and probably find out more things. This is the last house not quite standing in Yendestucky. 2007, took this picture. And it's closer to the ground now. This is Skundawoo's grave in 1908. A couple of things about Skundawoo. When the mission moved into Haines, Skundawoo was despondent. He was despairing and he was desperate. These people that he had fought against all this time were now moving into his territory. So he did what other shamans around Southeast Alaska had done to a certain extent, except he ramped up the drama much more. He began to hold witch hunts to show people that he could still find out who the causes of illnesses were, who the cause of pain was. If there was some problem or some illness going on in the village, he would seek out and find a witch and usually, finger that person, blame them, and then do something awful to them. These witch hunts, so-called, came because of the sense of desperation. His job had been taken out from under him. He had been the practitioner, but now he wasn't even trusted to be a practitioner anymore because his converted family would hardly speak to him anymore. He was told that he was evil. So he had to show his power in some way. So in 1893, Skundawoo fingered a young woman called Chesacht as a witch who was the source of someone else's illness. He tortured her. He staked her out on low tide. Tide came up, she died. At that point, Donawak, who was the head man out at Chilkoot, Yendestucky, said, okay, this is too much. He had converted too. He said, we cannot allow a murderer in here. So he called Juneau. He sent a canoe down to Juneau and said, bring the army. Military came up, and they began to hunt everywhere for Skundawoo. They rousted out all of the villages. They went in, and finally they found him in Dyea. And they put him in chains, put him on the boat, brought him back to Juneau, had a trial. It was on the front page of the paper. It was big news all over the place. They found him guilty for the murder of Chesacht. They sent him to San Quentin. He went to San Quentin for 3 years, and while he was there, he wrote some songs about his Tlingit land. Dixie Johnson, who was one of my informants, sang one of those songs for me. And some of those are still being sung. Well, after 3 years, Skundawu was released. He came back to Haines, and he was Sheriff Skundawu. He put a star on his chest, and he would let people take pictures with him for a quarter. And then in 1908, he passed away, and there is his grave. This is Charlie Brulette. He was also a person who worked with me closely on this, and he was the last matrilineally traditional Tlingit nephew of Skundawu. And Charlie passed away a few years ago. I interviewed him. I woke up one morning and said, "Oh no, I forgot to interview Charlie." And I ran out to his house. He was getting packed up to go to the hospital in Seattle. We interviewed for an hour right there, and he never came home. So he said a few things that were interesting about that as well. And here's Chilkat people at a very strong position here back in the day. There's Davidson Glacier today, actually just a few years ago. Right here, that canoe, it's a Tlingit-style canoe with a California guiding crew. But I will say the Tlingit culture and Tlingit nation is still, as we know, very much alive in Southeast Alaska and gaining strength and power all the time. I've worked with a lot of these people as a teacher and as a historian, oral historian, etc. A few years ago, one of the first large canoes was carved and set sail here, and I got to be there for the maiden voyage. And here they go. You can see Klekwan is way up there. They're heading that way. And there's Marcia Hotch. She's another person I spent quite a bit of time talking with, who was very joyful on that day. I wanted to end with some smiles because the Tlingit culture is very much alive and affects all of us in many ways, especially here in Southeast Alaska. And let's see. One more elder. There's Marilyn Wilson with my book. She sent me a little face chat with that picture at Christmas time. She had opened it up under the tree. So I feel like I left out a lot of things, but I think we've hit just a right amount. So thank you very much for your patience. And I would open this up for any questions. If anybody would like to come up here and ask the question, that's fine. If you'd like to ask it from there and I can just repeat it, that's okay too. But there's a lot of material in here. And anybody have any questions or thoughts?